After World War II, when American women were able to return to jobs such as writing after the war efforts ended, there was one question that was on the minds of almost every American woman that was writing horror. And that is, what if the monsters were actually men? That's right, for my very first episode, we're going to be doing a Would You Rather Be Trapped in a Forest with a Man or a Bear? And I'm going to be doing it through the work of Shirley Jackson. Now, Shirley Jackson is an author who, in my opinion, drastically reinvented post war horror fiction for America. She really carries on the same kind of tradition as Mary Shelley, where she's the progenitor to this new horror subgenre that then ends up being an inspiration to men, women, and pretty much everybody who goes on to write within the genre. Without Jackson, a lot of the other books that I'm looking forward to covering on this channel wouldn't exist. The Ballad of Black Tom, which is a reimagining of H.P. Lovecraft, a guy who's really well known for being racist, a reimagining of his work by a black man. Also, Tell Me I'm Worthless, which is a tale of a fascistic British haunted house written by a trans woman. Both of these stories owe their origins a lot to Shirley Jackson. She's a huge inspiration for a lot of authors who are talking about how their minority status affects them within a horror story. This video is one of several types of videos that I'm planning on doing on this channel, and the type of video that I'm really hoping can be the bread and butter for this channel, which is fiction reading and analysis. For these types of videos, I'm going to be giving a reading of the story, and I'll try to be emotive because I've noticed that a lot of other YouTubers that do these kinds of fiction reads they read it as though they're reading in class and they're bored. And I'm going to try to give you a slightly more energetic read to it than that. I think while I'm cutting to the reading, because I'm obviously not going to be making any kind of eye contact with the camera, I will probably cut to like an image that's like related to the story or something along those lines. I haven't wholly sorted that out yet. I'm leaving that up to editing, Zach, later on. If you're very interested in fiction or conspiracy theories or true crime, I'd really appreciate if you give the channel a subscribe. I'm looking to kind of rebuild my following on YouTube after Twitter has kind of crumbled over the last few years. And I'm trying to get a huge head start on that over the summer, since normally what I do is teach. But without further ado, I'd like to start to get into the story. The Allisons' country cottage, 7 miles from the nearest town, was set prettily on a hill. From 3 sides it looked down on soft trees and grass that seldom, even at midsummer, lay still and dry. On the 4th side was the lake, which touched against the wooden pier the Allisons had to keep repairing, and which looked equally well from the Allisons' front porch, their side porch, or any spot on the wooden staircase leading from the porch down to the water. Although the Allisons loved their summer cottage, looked forward to arriving in the early summer, and hated to leave in the fall, they had not troubled themselves to put in any improvements regarding the cottage itself, and the lake as improvement enough for the life left to them. The cottage had no heat, no running water except the precarious supply from the backyard pump, and no electricity. For 17 summers, Janet Allison had cooked on a kerosene stove, heating all their water. Robert Allison had brought buckets full of water daily from the pump, and read his paper by kerosene light in the evenings, and they had both, sanitary city people, become stolid and matter-of-fact about their back house. In the first 2 years, they had gone through all the standard vaudeville and magazine jokes about back houses, and by now, when they no longer had frequent guests to impress, they had subsided to a comfortable security which made the back house, as well as the pump and the kerosene, an indefinable asset to their summer life. The first thing that I want to look at here is how their summer life works. I think one thing that kind of becomes more apparent as the story goes on, but that Jackson is really laying the seeds for here at the start of the story, is the fact that they have not really made any upgrades to this cabin. They are still sitting in the exact same cabin that they first purchased, and that means that anything that goes wrong with their cabin is probably going to be their fault. They're not going to see it that way, but that's the actual truth. And so we start to get into this question of if the Allisons could be unreliable narrators because they have not done anything to upkeep their home, and yet they feel, and we'll see this as the story advances a little bit, as though they belong in this cabin. In themselves, the Allisons were ordinary people. Mrs. Allison was 58 years old, and Mr. Allison 60. They had seen their children outgrow the summer cottage and go on to families of their own in seashore resorts. Their friends were either dead or settled in comfortable year-round houses. Their nieces and nephews vague. In the winter, they told one another they could stand their New York apartment while waiting for the summer. In the summer, they told one another that the winter was well worthwhile waiting to get out to the country. Since they were old enough not to be ashamed of regular habits, the Allisons invariably left their summer cottage the Tuesday after Labor Day, and were as invariably sorry when the months of September and early October turned out to be pleasant and almost insufferably barren in the city. Each year they recognized that there was nothing to bring them back to New York. But it was not until this year that they overcame their traditional inertia enough to decide to stay at the cottage after Labor Day. There isn't really anything to take us back to the city, Mrs. Allison told her husband seriously, as though it was a new idea. And he told her, as though neither of them had ever considered it, we might as well enjoy the country as long as possible. Consequently, with much pleasure and a slight feeling of adventure, Mrs. Allison went into their village the day after Labor Day and told those natives with whom she had dealings, with a pretty air of breaking away from tradition, that she and her husband had decided to stay at least a month longer at their cottage. Another aspect of this that starts to introduce that horror of the husband, and we haven't really realized that yet, but we're going to get there eventually, is the idea that the Allisons are old and set in their ways. They're 58 and 60, and this story takes place in 1950. So these people would have been born in 1890 and 1892. I think that gives you a huge idea about how misogynistic someone like Mr. Allison might be, and how abusive he might be able to become if the situation was right. It isn't as though we had anything to take us back to the city, she said to Mr. Babcock, her grocer. We might as well enjoy the country while we can. Nobody ever stayed at the lake past Labor Day before, Mr. Babcock said. He was putting Mrs. Allison's groceries into a large cardboard carton, and he stopped for a minute to look reflectively into a bag of cookies. Nobody, he added. But the city! Mrs. Allison always spoke of the city to Mr. Babcock as though it were Mr. Babcock's dream to go there. It's so hot, you've really no idea. We're always sorry when we leave. Hate to leave, Mr. Babcock said. One of the most irritating native tricks Mrs. Allison had noticed was that of taking a trivial statement and rephrasing it downwards into an even more trite statement. I'd hate to leave myself, Mr. Babcock said, after deliberation, and both he and Mrs. Allison smiled. But I never heard of anyone ever staying out at the lake after Labor Day before. Well, we're going to give it a try, Mrs. Allison said, and Mr. Babcock replied gravely, never know till you try. So here, what Jackson is doing is introducing one of the solid genre staples of American horror in this really early story from the 1950s. So what she's doing is introducing the idea of these locals who are aggressive to the Allisons. This seems like a cliche to us now, but when Jackson was doing this, it was really innovative. It actually reminds me a lot of Turn of the Screw, which is the story where A Dark and Stormy Night comes from, which to us sounds like trash, but at the time, it was actually kind of innovative. The same thing's going on here with what Jackson's doing with the locals. Physically, Mrs. Allison decided, as she always did when leaving the grocery store, after one of her inconclusive conversations with Mr. Babcock, physically, Mr. Babcock could model for a statue of Daniel Webster. But mentally, it was horrible to think into what old New England Yankee stock had degenerated. She said as much to Mr. Allison when she got into the car, and he said, it's generations of inbreeding. That and the bad land. I should be able to read more of this here without interrupting it shortly. I hate to do it like paragraph to paragraph like I just did, but I think it's important to point out what's happening here. This is Jackson showing the first time that the Allisons are seen by the audience to be looking down at the people of the town. This is a really common thing in horror. The people who are going to have something bad happen to them have to have a reason to deserve it in the eyes of the audience for a lot of traditional horror. Because if they don't, you're going to risk alienating the audience. Now, there's some horror stories that don't do that at all. A Spit on Your Grave, I think, would be a good example of that. But for the most part, they try to show the people that are going to have something terrible happening to them in the future deserve those actions. And we're going to see that with some of the things that Mr. and Mrs. Allison say about the people in the town. Since this was their big trip into town, which they made only once every 2 weeks to buy things they could not have delivered, they spent all day at it, stopping to have a sandwich in the newspaper and soda shop, and leaving packages heaped in the back of the car. Although Mrs. Allison was able to order groceries delivered regularly, she was never able to form any accurate idea of Mr. Babcock's current stock by telephone, and her lists of odds and ends that might be procured was always supplemented, almost beyond their need, by the new and fresh local vegetables Mr. Babcock was selling temporarily, or the packaged candy which had just come in. This trip, Mrs. Allison was tempted too by the set of glass baking dishes that had found themselves completely by chance in the hardware and clothing and general store, and which had seemingly been waiting there for no one but Mrs. Allison, since the country people, with their instinctive distrust of anything that did not look as permanent as trees and rocks and sky, had only recently begun to experiment in aluminum baking dishes instead of ironware, and had apparently, within the memory of local inhabitants, discarded stoneware in favor of iron. Mrs. Allison had glass baking dishes carefully wrapped to endure the uncomfortable ride home over the rocky road that led up to the Allisons' cottage, and while Mr. Charlie Walpole, who, with his younger brother Albert, ran the hardware clothing general store, the store itself was called Johnson's, because it stood on the site of the old Johnson cabin, burned 50 years before Charlie Walpole was born, laboriously unfolded newspapers to wrap them around the dishes. Mrs. Allison said informally, "Of course, I could have waited and gotten those dishes in New York, but we're not going back so soon this year." I'm going to interrupt this scene a little bit here, because here we're introduced to one of the potential other ideas of what could be happening to the Allisons. With the old Johnson cabin both burning down and becoming a site for one of the local businesses, it could stand to reason that the people of the town burned down a cabin of people who stayed after Labor Day. So if the Allisons are being targeted, they could be being targeted for their property. I think the only problem with that interpretation, and there is one big problem, their house is described as being very far away from the town. It seems to me that if the locals were targeting a cabin for that reason, they'd probably be targeting one that is closer to the other stores. And because of that, I'm not super huge on that interpretation, but I do understand where it's coming from. "Heard you was staying on," Mr. Charlie Walpole said. His old fingers fumbled maddeningly with the thin sheets of newspaper, carefully trying to isolate only one sheet at a time, and he did not look up at Mrs. Allison as he went on. "Don't know about staying on up there to the lake. Not after Labor Day." "Well, you know," Mrs. Allison said, quite as though he deserved an explanation, "it just seemed to us that we've been hurrying back to New York every year, and there just wasn't any need for it. You know what the city's like in the fall." And she smiled confidingly up at Mr. Charlie Walpole. I will remind you all, Walpole does not know what the city's like in the fall. Rhythmically, he wound string around the package. "He's giving me a piece long enough to save," Mrs. Allison thought, and she looked away quickly to avoid giving any sign of impatience. "I feel sort of like we belong here more," she said, "staying on here after everyone has left." To prove this, she smiled brightly across the store at a woman with a familiar face, who might have been the woman who sold berries to the Allisons one year, or the woman who occasionally helped in the grocery, and was probably Mr. Babcock's aunt. The irony here is that the people that are saying that they belong here don't even know or recognize the people that they're talking to. "Well," Mr. Charlie Walpole said, he shoved the package a little across the counter, to show that it was finished and that for a sale well made, a package well wrapped, he was willing to accept pay. "Well," he said again, "never been summer people before, at the lake after Labor Day." Mrs. Allison gave him a $5 bill, and he made change methodically, giving great weight even to the pennies. "Never after Labor Day," he said, and nodded at Mrs. Allison, and went soberly along the store to deal with two women who were looking at cotton house dresses. As Mrs. Allison passed on her way out, she heard one of the women say cutely, "Why is one of them dresses $1.99, and this one here is only 98?" "They're great people," Mrs. Allison told her husband as they went together down the sidewalk after meeting at the door of the hardware store. "They're so solid, and so reasonable, and so honest." "Makes you feel good knowing there are still towns like this," Mr. Allison said. "You know, in New York," Mrs. Allison said, "I might have paid a few cents less for these dishes, but there wouldn't have been anything sort of personal in the transaction." So this is the other kind of looking down on the people of the town that the Allisons are going to do in this story. And unlike the kind of denigrating of calling them inbred, this one's slightly different. This is paternalism. So instead of looking down at them for being less than them, they look down at them as being humble or being salt of the earth. This is kind of like your noble savage idea that these people are better than them because they come from nothing. And again, it's still a way of looking down on them. So they're really always showing that they don't view the people of the town as one of them. "Staying on to the lake?" Mrs. Martin in the newspaper and sandwich shop asked the Allisons. "Heard you was staying on." "Thought we'd take advantage of the lovely weather this year," Mr. Allison said. Mrs. Martin was a comparative newcomer to the town. She had married into the newspaper and sandwich shop from a neighboring farm and had stayed on after her husband's death. She served bottled soft drinks and fried egg and onion sandwiches on thick bread, which she made on her own stove at the back of the store. Occasionally, when Mrs. Martin served a sandwich, it would carry with it the rich fragrance of the stew or the pork chops cooking alongside for Mrs. Martin's dinner. "I don't guess anyone's ever stayed out there so long before," Mrs. Martin said. "Not after Labor Day, anyway." "I guess Labor Day is when they usually leave," Mr. Hall, the Allisons' nearest neighbor, told them later in front of Mr. Babcock's store, where the Allisons were getting into their car to go home. "Surprised you're staying on." "It seemed a shame to go so soon," Mrs. Allison said. Mr. Hall lived 3 miles away. He supplied the Allisons with butter and eggs, and occasionally, from the top of their hill, the Allisons could see the lights in his house in the early evening before the Halls went to bed. "They usually leave Labor Day," Mr. Hall said. The ride home was long enough. It was beginning to get dark, and Mr. Allison had to drive very carefully over the dirt road by the lake. Mrs. Allison lay back against the seat, pleasantly relaxed after a day of what seemed whirlwind shopping compared with their day-to-day existence. The new glass baking dishes lurked agreeably in her mind, and the half-bushel of red eating apples, and the package of colored thumbtacks with which she was going to put up new shelf edging in the kitchen. "Good to get home," she said softly as they came in sight of their cottage, silhouetted above them against the sky. "Glad we decided to stay on," Mr. Allison agreed. Mrs. Allison spent the next morning lovingly washing her baking dishes, although in his innocence, Charlie Walpole had neglected to notice the chip in the edge of one. She decided wastefully to use some of the red eating apples in a pie for dinner, and while the pie was in the oven and Mr. Allison was down getting the mail, she sat out on the little lawn the Allisons had made at the top of the hill, and watched the changing lights on the lake, alternating gray and blue as clouds moved quickly across the sun. Mr. Allison came back a little out of sorts. It always irritated him to walk the mile to the mailbox on the state road and come back with nothing, even though he assumed that the walk was good for his health. This morning there was nothing but a circular from a New York department store, and their New York paper, which arrived erratically by mail from 1 to 4 days later than it should, so that some days the Allisons might have 3 papers, and frequently none. Mrs. Allison, although she shared with her husband the annoyance of not having mail when they so anticipated it, pored affectionately over the department store circular, and made a mental note to drop in at the store when she finally went back to New York and check on the sale of wool blankets. It was hard to find good ones in pretty colors nowadays. She debated saving the circular to remind herself, but after thinking about getting up and getting into the cottage to put it away safely somewhere, she dropped it into the grass beside her chair and lay back, her eyes half closed. "Looks like we might have some rain," Mr. Allison said, squinting at the sky. "Good for the crops," Mrs. Allison said laconically, and they both laughed. I don't know if it's necessarily apparent to everybody what the Allisons are doing here, but this is also them looking down at the people of the town. Here, they're imagining what the people in the town would be saying to each other when it rains, and they're sharing it between each other as a kind of inside joke. The joke is they have better things to talk about than the people in town. Again, it shows that they don't view themselves as people of the town, they view themselves as their betters, even though they say the town's their home. The kerosene man came the next morning while Mr. Allison was down getting the mail. They were getting low on kerosene, and Mrs. Allison greeted the man warmly. He sold kerosene and ice, and during the summer, hauled garbage away for the summer people. A garbage man was only necessary for improvident city folk. Country people had no garbage. "I'm glad to see you," Mrs. Allison told him. "We were getting pretty low." The kerosene man, whose name Mrs. Allison had never learned, again they don't belong, used a hose attachment to fill the 20-gallon tan which supplied light and heat and cooking facilities for the Allisons. But today, instead of swinging down from his true and hooking the hose from where it coiled affectionately around the cab of the truck, the man stared uncomfortably at Mrs. Allison, his truck motor still going. "Thought you folks would be leaving," he said. "We're staying on another month," Mrs. Allison said brightly. "The weather was so nice, and it seemed like—" "That's what they told me," the man said. "Can't give you no oil, though." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Allison raised her eyebrows. "We're just going to keep up with our regular—" "After Labor Day," the man said. "I don't get so much oil myself after Labor Day." Mrs. Allison reminded herself, as she had frequently to do when in disagreement with her neighbors, that city manners were no good with country people. You could not expect to overrule a country employee as you could a city worker. And Mrs. Allison smiled engagingly as she said, "But can't she get extra oil, at least while we stay?" "You see," the man said. He tapped his finger exasperatingly against the car wheel as he spoke. "You see," he said slowly, "I order this oil. I'll order it down from maybe 55 mile away. I'll order back in June. How much I'll need for the summer? Then I order again, about November. Round about now, it's starting to get pretty short." As if the subject were closed, he stopped tapping his finger and tightened his hands on the wheel in preparation for departure. "But can't you give us some?" Mrs. Allison said. "Isn't there anyone else?" "Don't know as you could get oil anywhere else right now," the man said consideringly. "I can't give you none." Before Mrs. Allison could speak, the truck began to move. Then it stopped for a minute, and he looked at her through the back window of the cab. "Ice?" he called. "I could let you have some ice." Mrs. Allison shook her head. They were not terribly low on ice, and she was angry. She ran a few steps to catch up with the truck, calling, "Will you try to get us some? Next week?" "Don't see as I can," the man said. "After Labor Day, it's harder." The truck drove away, and Mrs. Allison, only confronted by the thought that she could probably get kerosene from Mr. Babcock, or at worst the Halls, watched it go with anger. Next summer, she told herself. Just let him try coming around next summer. We can pretty clearly see that the people of town don't want the Allisons here. There's a couple more subtle things, like, for instance, the chip in the dish that Mr. Babcock sells Mrs. Allison. Mrs. Allison assumes that the chip is a result of accident, but it could be just as obvious that he doesn't want her there. Then there's the kerosene. I think with the kerosene, it could even be true that the kerosene has to be ordered in advance. For a lot of utilities, that is true. But everything is starting to combine in Mrs. Allison's head and give her the idea that she's unwanted and that the people of the town are trying to do something to get them to leave. And how far that paranoia goes, we'll only see really after the letter arrives from the Allison's son. There was no mail again, only the paper, which seemed to be coming doggedly on time, and Mr. Allison was openly cross when he returned. When Mrs. Allison told him about the kerosene man, he was not particularly impressed. "Probably keeping it all for a high price during the winter," he commented. "What's happened to Anne and Jerry, do you think?" Anne and Jerry were their son and daughter, both married, one living in Chicago, one in the far west. Their dutiful weekly letters were late. So late, in fact, that Mr. Allison's annoyance at the lack of mail was able to settle on a legitimate grievance. "Ought to realize how we wait for their letters," he said. "Thoughtless, selfish children. Ought to know better." "Well, dear," Mrs. Allison said placatingly. Anger at Anne and Jerry would not relieve her emotions toward the kerosene man. After a few minutes, she said, "Wishing won't bring the mail, dear. I'm going to call Mr. Babcock and tell him to send up some kerosene with my order. At least a postcard, Mr. Allison said as she left. As with most of the cottage's inconveniences, the Allisons no longer noticed the phone particularly, but yielded to its eccentricities without conscious complaint. It was a wall phone of a type still seen in only few communities. In order to get the operator, Mrs. Allison had first to turn the side crank and ring once. Usually it took 2 or 3 tries to force the operator to answer, and Mrs. Allison, making any kind of telephone call, approached the phone with resignation and a sort of desperate patience. She had to crank the phone 3 times this morning before the operator answered, and then it was still longer before Mr. Babcock picked up the receiver at his phone in the corner of the grocery store behind the meat table. He said, "Store?" with the rising inflection that seemed to indicate suspicion of anyone who tried to communicate with him by means of this unreliable instrument. "This is Mrs. Allison, Mr. Babcock. I thought I'd give you my order a day early because I wanted to be sure and get some—" "What say, Mrs. Allison?" Mrs. Allison raised her voice a little. She saw Mr. Allison out on the lawn, turn in his chair and regard her sympathetically. "I said, Mr. Babcock, I thought I'd call my order early so you could send me—" "Mrs. Allison?" Mr. Babcock said. "You'll come and pick it up?" "Pick it up?" In her surprise, Mrs. Allison let her voice drop back to its normal tone, and Mr. Babcock said loudly, "What's that, Mrs. Allison?" "I thought I'd have you send it out as usual," Mrs. Allison said. "Well, Mrs. Allison," Mr. Babcock said, and there was a pause while Mrs. Allison waited, staring past the phone over her husband's head out into the sky. "Mrs. Allison," Mr. Babcock went on finally, "I'll tell you, my boy's been working for me, went back to school yesterday, and now I got no one to deliver. I only got a boy delivering summers, you see." "I thought you always delivered," Mrs. Allison said. "Not after Labor Day, Mrs. Allison," Mr. Babcock said firmly. "You never been here after Labor Day before, so you wouldn't know, of course." "Well, Mrs. Allison," said helplessly. Far inside her mind she was saying over and over, "Can't use city manners on country folk. No use getting mad." "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "Couldn't you just send out an order today, Mr. Babcock?" "Matter of fact," Mr. Babcock said, "I guess I couldn't, Mrs. Allison. It wouldn't hardly pay delivering with no one else out at the lake." "What about Mr. Hall?" Mrs. Allison asked suddenly. "The people who live about 3 miles away from us out here. Mr. Hall could bring it out when he comes." "Hall?" Mr. Babcock said. "John Hall? They've gone to visit our folks upstate, Mrs. Allison." "But they bring all our butter and eggs," Mrs. Allison said, appalled. "Left yesterday," Mr. Babcock said. "Probably didn't think you folks would stay up on there." "But I told Mr. Hall," Mrs. Allison started to say and then stopped. "I'll send Mr. Allison in after some groceries tomorrow," she said. "You got all you need till then?" Mr. Babcock said, satisfied. It was not a question, but a confirmation. After she hung up, Mrs. Allison went slowly out to sit again in her chair next to her husband. "He won't deliver," she said. "You'll have to go in tomorrow. We got just enough kerosene to last till you get back." "You should have told us sooner," Mr. Allison said. I didn't want to interrupt the scene between Mr. Babcock and Mrs. Allison because I think it really sets the tone for the rest of the story that comes after. But there are a few things that I think are worth pointing out that happened during that scene. The first is that Mr. Allison blames Babcock and John Hall for not warning them that they wouldn't be able to get everything they need delivered to the cabins if they stayed past Labor Day. But the Allisons never really asked anyone. They just decided themselves that they were going to be staying after Labor Day and didn't ask anyone in the town if they could support them staying past Labor Day. It really shows the audience that Mr. Allison is someone who is quick to blame others for things that he should have taken care of. And so the idea that Mr. Allison could completely lose his temper and take it out on Mrs. Allison is being planted during that scene. There's also just the complete refusal of Mr. Babcock to help them at all, which I think further cements the idea that the townspeople could be plotting against the Allisons. Though, like I said, there's some things that help convince you, too, that this could all be in their head. The weather continued fair the next morning. Mr. Allison, duly armed with a list of groceries, with kerosene in large letters at the top, went down the path to the garage, and Mrs. Allison began another pie in her new baking dishes. She had mixed the crust and was starting to pare the apples when Mr. Allison came rapidly up the path and flung open the screen door to the kitchen. "Damn car won't start," he announced. with the end of the tether voice of a man who depends on a car as he depends on his right arm. "What's wrong with it?" Mrs. Allison demanded, stopping with the paring knife in one hand and an apple in the other. "It was all right on Tuesday." "Well," Mr. Allison said between his teeth, "it's not all right on Friday." "Can you fix it?" Mrs. Allison asked. "No," Mr. Allison said. "I cannot. Gotta call someone, I guess." "Who?" Mrs. Allison asked. "Man who runs the filling station, I guess." Mr. Allison moved purposefully towards the phone. "He fixed it last summer one time." A little apprehensive, Mrs. Allison went on paring apples absent-mindedly while she listened to Mr. Allison with the phone, ringing, waiting, finally giving the number to the operator, then waiting again and giving the number again, giving the number a third time, and then slamming down the receiver. "No one there," he announced it as he came into the kitchen. "He's probably gone out for a minute," Mrs. Allison said nervously. She was not quite sure what made her so nervous, unless it was the probability of her husband losing his temper completely. "He's there alone, I imagine, so if he goes out there, there's no one to answer the phone." This is the other potential horror of the story. The idea that the people of the town could care less about the Allisons, but they have their own things to take care of. And yet, the Allisons have been left there, stranded, particularly Mrs. Allison, with her husband who has a huge anger problem, is probably a misogynist, and doesn't always treat her correct. I think that is really the true horror of the story, especially when you consider that Shirley Jackson's husband was financially abusive towards her. I think that really cements the idea that the thing that she wanted to focus on the most in this story as a theme is the idea of domestic violence as an actual horror within American society. "That must be it," Mr. Allison said with heavy irony. He slumped into one of the kitchen chairs and watched Mrs. Allison paring apples. After a minute, Mrs. Allison said soothingly, "Why don't you go down and get the mail and then call him again?" Mr. Allison debated and then said, "Guess I might as well." He rose heavily, and when we got to the kitchen door, he turned and said, "But if there's no mail," and leaving an awful silence behind him, he went off down the path. Mrs. Allison hurried with her pie. Twice she went up to the window to glance into the sky to see if there were clouds coming up. The room seemed unexpectedly dark, and she herself felt the state of tension that preceded a thunderstorm. But both times when she looked, the sky was clear and serene, smiling indifferently down on the Allison summer cottage as well as on the rest of the world. Yeah, I saved it until I got there. That's where I was. Okay. Mrs. Allison looked with an eagerness that surprised her on the familiar handwriting of her son. She could not imagine why the letter excited her so, except that it was the first they'd received in so long. It would be a pleasant, dutiful letter, full of the doings of Alice and the children, reporting progress with his job, commenting on the recent weather in Chicago, closing with love from all. Both Mr. and Mrs. Allison could, if they wished, recite a pattern letter from either of their children. Mr. Allison slit the letter open with great deliberation, and then he spread it out on the kitchen table, and they leaned down and read it together. Or so, except that it was the first they'd received in so long. It would be a pleasant, dutiful letter, full of the doings of Alice and the children, reporting progress with his job, commenting on the recent weather in Chicago, closing with love from all. Both Mr. and Mrs. Allison could, if they wished, recite a pattern letter from either of their children. Mr. Allison slit the letter open with great deliberation, and then he spread it out on the kitchen table, and they leaned down and read it together. Like as usual, we always thought you came back too soon and ought to stay up there as long as you could. Alice says that now that you're not as young as you used to be, and have no demands on your time, fewer friends, etc. in the city, you ought to get what fun you can while you can. Since you two are both happy up there, it's a good idea for you to stay. Uneasily, Mrs. Allison glanced sideways at her husband. He was reading intently, and she reached out and picked up the empty envelope, not knowing exactly what she wanted from it. It was addressed quite as usual, in Jerry's handwriting, and was postmarked Chicago. Of course it's postmarked Chicago, she thought quickly. Why would they want to postmark it anywhere else? When she looked back down at the letter, her husband had turned the page, and she read on with him. And of course, if they get measles, etc. now, they will be better off later. Alice is well, of course. Me too. Been playing a lot of bridge lately with some people you don't know named Carruthers. Nice young couple about our age. Well, we'll close now, as I guess it bores you to hear about things so far away. Tell Dad old Dixon in our Chicago office died. He used to ask about Dad a lot. Have a good time up at the lake, and don't bother about hurrying back. Love from all of us, Jerry. Funny, Mr. Allison commented. It doesn't sound like Jerry, Mrs. Allison said in a small voice. He never wrote anything like... She stopped. Like what? Mr. Allison demanded. Never wrote anything like what? Mrs. Allison turned the letter over, frowning. It was impossible to find any sentence, any word even, that did not sound like Jerry's regular letters. Perhaps it was only that the letter was so late, or the unusual number of dirty fingerprints on the envelope. I don't know, she said impatiently. Gonna try that phone again, Mr. Allison said. Mrs. Allison read the letter twice more, trying to find a phrase that sounded wrong. Then Mr. Allison came back and said very quietly, Phone's dead. What? Mrs. Allison said, dropping the letter. Phone's dead, Mr. Allison said. The rest of the day went quickly. After a lunch of crackers and milk, the Allisons went to sit outside on the lawn, but their afternoon was cut short by the gradually increasing storm clouds that came up over the lake to the cottage, so that it was as dark as evening by 4 o'clock. Earlier in the story, the sereneness of the summer cottage showed that nothing bad was going to happen to the Allisons, so this has now been interrupted. The storm delayed, however, as though in loving anticipation of the moment it would break over the summer cottage, and there was an occasional flash of lightning, but no rain. In the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Allison, sitting close together inside the cottage, turned on the battery radio they had brought with them from New York. There were no lamps lighted in the cottage, and the only light came from the lightning outside and the small square glow from the dial of the radio. The slight framework of the cottage was not strong enough to withstand the city noises, the music and the voices from the radio, and the Allisons could hear them from far off echoing across the lake, the saxophones and the New York dance band wailing over the water, the flat voice of the girl vocalist going inexorably out into the clean country air. Even the announcer, speaking glowingly of the virtues of razor blades, was no more than an inhuman voice sounding out from the Allisons' cottage and echoing back, as though the lake and the hills and the trees were returning it unwanted. What Jackson's doing here is almost giving the lake a kind of haunted house quality. There's an otherworldliness to the rejection of the Allisons, that they don't belong here. And whether that is through something supernatural, the people of the village, or just in the Allisons' own heads, they are going to be punished for having decided to force themselves on the people of this town. During one pause between commercials, Mrs. Allison turned and smiled weakly at her husband. I wonder if we're supposed to do anything, she said. No, Mr. Allison said consideringly. I don't think so. Just wait. Mrs. Allison caught her breath quickly, and Mr. Allison said under the trivial melody of the dance beginning again, the car had been tampered with, you know. Even I could see that. Mrs. Allison hesitated a minute, and then said very softly, I suppose the phone wires were cut. I imagine so, Mr. Allison said. After a while, the dance music stopped, and they listened attentively to a news broadcast, the announcer's rich voice telling them breathlessly of a marriage in Hollywood, the latest baseball scores, the estimated rise in food prices during the coming week. He spoke to them in the summer cottage, quite as though they still deserved to hear news of a world that no longer reached them except through the fallible batteries on the radio, which were already beginning to fade, almost as though they still belonged, however tenuously, to the rest of the world. Mrs. Allison glanced out the window at the smooth surface of the lake, the black masses of the trees, and the waiting storm, and said conversationally, I feel better about that letter of Jerry's. I knew when I saw the light down at the Hall place last night, Mr. Allison said. The wind coming up suddenly over the lake swept around the summer cottage and slapped hard at the windows. Mr. and Mrs. Allison involuntarily moved closer together, and with the first sudden crash of thunder, Mr. Allison reached out and took his wife's hand. And then, while the lightning flashed outside and the radio faded and sputtered, the two old people huddled together in their summer cottage and waited. And that was The Summer People by Shirley Jackson. So, one of the aspects of this that I think is like really cool is the ambiguity. I think ambiguity is maybe one of the elements of horror that I consider most important. The idea that you don't know what aspects of the story are the monster here being either the people in the village or Mr. Allison, and what parts are in the head of the people involved. And I think all of that ambiguity here really works in Jackson's favor. At the end of the story, we don't know whether Mrs. Allison is right, and this is all in their heads, or whether Mr. Allison is right, and the people in the village have been stalking them all this time. Projects like this have a light scripts. It's mostly just a transcription of my notes on the story and a few notes here and there about what to say at the beginning. However, I'm working on a few different approaches, including novel summaries and analysis, which is going to be a little different because I can't read a whole novel aloud on the video, and a few other different types of videos. I'm looking at true crime and also going back to conspiracy content, which is something that I've done for quite some time, but I really want this kind of stuff to be the bread and butter of the channel. So if you have any suggestions for anything you'd like to see on this channel, I'd love to hear it in the comments, and I think that's really it. So, see ya.